Well, folks, we're back, and now we're going to do is we're going to start to talk a little about the nervous system. We briefly talked a little about the interaction with the nervous system, with the musculoskeletal system, particularly in how muscles work. But I think there's a lot more that we need to talk about in regards to the nervous system, and that's what we're going to be talking about over the next couple of minutes in this short presentation. When we look at the nervous system, basically we could divide it into two main divisions. One is called the central nervous system, and the other is the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is basically consisting of the brain and the spinal cord. That's all it is. The peripheral nervous system is everything outside the brain and spinal cord, all the nerves that go to my organs, it goes to individual muscles, and that's called the peripheral nervous system. Think about the central nervous system, though, and we'll be talking and we'll be giving some more videos in regards to just about the central nervous system. That central nervous system is a largely integrative in regards to what happens. It's receiving sensations all the time, input all the time, and making decisions as to what to do in regards to that. And what happens is when something happens, when it receives some type of a signal, it has to create some type of effect. And that's what the central nervous system basically does. It's sort of like that central area where everything happens. That peripheral nervous system, we could further subdivide, though. And that's once we get outside the brain and spinal cord, all these individual nerves that are leaving the spinal cord. If you remember when we went back and looked in the lab, you saw those little yellow cords that were coming out between each of the vertebrae, laterally and the sides. And those are going out to various areas throughout the body to take nerve impulses to where they have to go. Okay. This peripheral nervous system, we could grossly divide into a couple different areas. Number one, the somatic nerves. Somatic nerves are basically nerves that go to muscle and skin. And we have two words here that we've actually had before that we should mention again. One is afferent. Afferent means going towards the brain and central nervous system, and the other is efferent, meaning going away from the brain and the central nervous system. Sensory nerves, which perceive sensation on the external portion of my body, temperature, touch, pain, stuff like that, as well as temperature, my ambient temperature around me, and things like that. I pick up that sensation at the periphery of the body or somewhere in the body, and then have to take that information, whether it be directly outside the body or from internal organs, takes that sensory information and takes it to the brain. So they're called afferent nerves because it's taking that information and sampling of what's going on around us and within us to the brain, and this is afferent. On the other hand, what happens is the brain then is going to analyze it. We're going to talk about that in just a second, how it analyzes things, and then what it does is it has to send out some messages from the brain to the rest of the body to do the right thing. Okay, and these are what we called efferent nerves. A motor nerve, like we talked about in our last presentation in regards to motor function or muscle function, is basically efferent. We also have a second portion of my peripheral nervous system. This is called the autonomic nervous system, where motor function, such as going to the muscles, is very voluntary. I mean, I have to tell my arm to do this. I have to tell my mouth to move to be able to say words. What happens is the autonomic nervous system is involuntary, and these nerves go to primarily to viscera, which means all the organs, the heart, the lungs, the esophagus, the stomach, the intestines, the bladder, all those things like that, as well as vessels, to allow vessels to either open or close depending upon where I need blood flow to go. And we don't really control those. I can't really say, okay, stomach, start to digest. This is something that automatically happens. It's involuntary. Okay, so basically these areas, this autonomic function, instead of being in the higher centers of the brain and the cerebral cortex, sometimes start a little bit lower, more from the brainstem and the midbrain and the hypothalamus area inside deeper centers within the brain. And basically, we divide this into two different types of things. The autonomic nervous system can be further divided or subdivided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, again, these are involuntary. We really can't control them. The body makes responses without us thinking. Okay. But when I look at the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system, in most cases, the sympathetic nervous system speeds things up. If you get excited or you get startled or scared, what happens? You know, your heart race is a little bit faster. Your blood pressure may rise and stuff like that. You start to breathe a little faster and deeper, and that's an effect of the sympathetic nervous system, making things working faster. The parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, has a tendency to slow things down. So as a result, if you take your fingers and feel the pulse in your wrist, okay, you can feel that boom, boom, boom in the radial artery pulse, if you hold your breath, what you actually feel is you'll feel that pulse goes down. And the reason why it goes down is the 10th cranial nerve, or the vagus nerve, which is in the base of the brain, at the bottom surface of the brain, actually comes out and leaves through a canal, one of those canals we talked about in the lab, and goes to everywhere. It goes to the esophagus, it goes to the lungs, it goes to the heart, it goes to the stomach, it goes to the intestines, it goes everywhere. But the fibers are primarily parasympathetic. So when I hold my breath, it stimulates the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve actually slows down the heart rate. So when you feel that slowing your heart rate, it's a stimulation of the parasympathetic activity of the vagus nerve, or the 10th cranial nerve. One exception to this, which is a very notable exception, is where the heart, the lungs, and other and vessels, are stimulated one way with the sympathetic nervous system. The gastrointestinal system seems to be more under the control of the parasympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system sort of guides all that motion that we have in the intestines to move food around from one place to the other. In fact, what happens is when we eat, that same vagus nerve, as it passes through the diaphragm and gets to the stomach, has little fibers that goes to the stomach. And once that vagus nerve, because of stimulus that we get, an afferent stimulus coming in regards to smell, taste, and stuff like that, that vagus nerve starts to create a stimulus that actually causes it to stimulate certain cells in the wall of the stomach, which are called parietal cells. And these parietal cells are actually what make the acids, the gastric acid, to be able to help it digest. And that's under control of the parasympathetic nervous system. So, and then we have, in regards to the peripheral nervous system, we also have the cranial nerves. Now, we've talked about this very briefly in lab, didn't spend a whole lot of time. What happens, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they originate on the bottom surface of the brain, on the very undersurface of the brain, and they go to different areas. Now, cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve, which basically goes through that cribriform plate with those little holes that we talked about next to that crista galli, through the ethmoid bone into the roof of the nose. The second cranial nerve is the optic nerve that goes through that optic canal we talked about in the back of the orbit, that little hole in the back of the orbit that basically is the visual nerve. It sends the signals that the receptors in my eye will be able to perceive, sends it back to the occipital portion of my brain, the back portion of my brain, where my visual centers are, and I'm able to see. 3, 4, and 6 basically have a hole, that crack, that superior orbital fissure that we saw in the back of the orbit as well. They go to the muscles of the eye that allow my eyes to move in all different directions. So these are some of the cranial nerves. And again, there's 12 pairs. 8 would be for hearing and balance. 7 is for facial expression. 5 is for sensation of the face and little taste and stuff like that. 9 and 10 are gag, and also the vagus nerve, which is 10. 11 for just shoulder shrugging, and 12 for, if you watch the bottom corner, sticking your tongue out. Okay, so these are cranial nerves. There's 12 pairs that come from the brain. They have special names, but they're also referred to as cranial nerve 1 through 12 as Roman numerals. We also know we have spinal nerves. These are the nerves that come out of the spinal cord itself. And when we looked at the vertebral model in the lab, we saw these yellow cords coming out from the spinal cord through those little canals on the lateral surfaces of between each adjacent vertebrae. And basically, once that nerve leaves the spinal cord, it's no longer a portion of the central nervous system because it's left the spinal cord. Now it becomes part of the peripheral nervous system. And there are actually 31 pairs of these that originate from the spinal cord itself. So this is how the nervous system is basically divided again in the central nervous system, which is brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is everything that leaves it. And that peripheral nervous system could be somatic versus autonomic. Also, we have to talk about the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves that we just talked about. And this is just another flow chart that shows the same thing that we talked about just a second ago. And basically, if we look here and look at this, we talked about our nervous system as being, the whole shebang here. And the central nervous system is really simple to think about. We'll be spending a lot more time on that in subsequent videos, which is basically the brain, the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. And that peripheral nervous system then is divided, into one thing I should mention here is we have both our somatic nerves, voluntary, and our involuntary or autonomic. But what happens is, let's say if we have a nerve, if someone just drops a cadaver in your living room or something like that, and you're able to do some dissection on your coffee table, I doubt if that's ever going to happen. But if that would happen, if you pulled out a nerve, if you look at that nerve, these nerves are usually mixed. What I mean by mixed is they have nerves that are actually running in both directions, both afferent, running from the periphery towards the brain, as well as efferent, running from the brain out. So we have signals running in both directions. It's sort of like a highway where you have one lane going one way and you have one lane going the other way, and that's what we find. And then when I look at these mixed nerves, part of them are motor and part of them are sensory. Okay, and when we talk about those motor nerves, we have involuntary or somatic, or voluntary or somatic, or involuntary or autonomic, and we talked about the difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So what really happens, and how does this nervous system work? Well, first of all, what the body's doing, whether you're awake, whether you're asleep, whatever the case may be, whether you're in class trying to go asleep, okay, or trying to stay awake, maybe for some students, what happens is you're constantly sampling everything around you and within you, and the sensations that we get either by chemicals in my body, by temperature on the outside, whatever the case may be, is detected by the nervous system. We're constantly sampling everything we do, everywhere we are, every single second of the day. And what happens is it detects those internal and external stimuli, both inside my body and outside my body, and sends afferent signals, again going towards the brain, back to the brain, with this information. So it's sort of like saying, hey, this is what we know. They're giving the brain the information that it needs to make a decision. Once that information gets to the brain integrates it. It looks at that, it stores it, it analyzes it, it records it, and what happens, it says, it makes a decision as to whether this is good, whether this is bad. If it's good, guess what? Hey, if it's good, you can't make perfect anything any more perfect. But on the other hand, if it's bad, what are you going to do about it? And so what happens in the brain itself, in various centers in the brain, it's this integrative function where it looks at the information and determines if it's good, if it's bad. If it's bad, send it to somewhere to be able to make a change so that now we get back on track. And that's what we talked about from day one, called homeostasis. Okay, and again, what happens in the brain, we have a number of small little what are called interneurons. So short neurons connect one neuron to the other neuron, so we can share information a little bit more easily. What happens is, once the brain's made a determination as to what needs to be done, it sends out a motor signal, an efferent signal, one way or the other, to various areas of the body to make those changes. And this is what we call going to effectors. Effectors mean it's the end result. It's the product of that change that we get, and thereby efferent nerves leaving the brain, again going from the brain outwards. So in summary, what we know is we detect everything around us, and our sensory nerves provide the brain with that information. The brain takes that information, analyzes it, and decides if something needs to be done, and then sends out some type of a signal, an efferent signal from there to make a change, and that's what we call homeostasis. Okay, and so homeostasis, again, receptors detect the stimuli, the information that we have is transmitted directly to the brain, that information is processed, analyzed in the brain in the appropriate region. Again, there's lots of different regions of the brain. We'll be talking a little bit more about how the brain is set up when we get to some of our subsequent videos. And what happens is then the brain sends a specific message out to an effector to initiate a particular change. Now, one thing I should mention very briefly here is that what happens is the neurological system doesn't do this all itself. What happens is there's also a second system that's important, or that's very critical in regards to homeostasis, and that's called the endocrine system. Now, here's the problem with the endocrine system. The endocrine system is composed of a number of glands. There's like the thyroid gland, the pituitary gland, the pineal gland in the brain, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, even the gonads, the ovaries and the testes. And all these glands, that basically what they do is they're very vascular. And they have to be vascular for a reason, which I'll explain in just a minute. What these glands do is they make various things called hormones. And these hormones are basically chemicals that these glands then secrete to cause a change. So if something happens, if let's say I eat, okay, now my blood glucose starts to go up. As my blood glucose goes up, my pancreas says, hey, the blood glucose is going up, I got to get some of that glucose into the cell for energy, and the pancreas then will actually start to secrete a hormone called insulin. The insulin goes and circulates throughout the body, goes to various cells, binds to certain insulin receptors on the surface of cells, and allows the doors to open in the cells to allow the glucose to be able to get inside the cell. And that's what happens in regards to the endocrine system. Now, here's the problem with the endocrine system. It takes a while for that to happen. It's not like instantaneous. The neurological system and the endocrine system work hand in hand. They're working very closely together. However, the neurological system, the brain and spinal cord and peripheral nerves, works faster. The endocrine system has a tendency to work a little bit slower. It takes a little bit longer time to get things up and running with the endocrine system as compared to the neurological system. Obviously, the neurological system has a lot of effect on the endocrine system because it does send efferent signals to the endocrine organs to have the endocrine organs do things. In fact, when we talked about the pituitary, remember how about when we looked at the skull, there's that hypophyseal fossa just behind the eyes, okay, where the in that just behind where the optic nerve crossed. We showed that in the lab. What happens is that pituitary is connected by a small stalk directly up to the hypothalamus, which is on the bottom side of the brain, and it gets signals from the hypothalamus, which is also an area that analyzes and processes that sensory information that goes in the brain, takes that information and sends it down to the pituitary, so the pituitary can secrete one of the appropriate eight or different numbers of hormones that the pituitary then creates, okay? Even though the pituitary is only about the size of a pea, it's about the size of the tip of my little finger, very small organ. So the neurological system does send that information to the endocrine system, so the endocrine system can also send out these hormones to circulate throughout the body to create a change, okay? And that's how homeostasis is maintained rapidly, much more rapidly by the neurological system, and very effectively, but a little bit more slowly by the endocrine system. This is what we talked about in probably our first lecture. We talked about responsiveness, and responsiveness is one of the things that the neurological system sort of takes mastery over. And responsiveness is just simply the body's ability to detect and respond to changes in its internal, external environment and make the appropriate changes or responses to be able to get the body back in that homeostatic control, which is what the body loves. The body loves to be homeostatically controlled. The body doesn't like anything different. Okay, it wants to be the same. So basically, this responsiveness depends upon receiving information from the receptors. The receptors have to be working, send the signals afferently to the brain. The brain then analyzes this, okay, and then will send out through effectors and create and affect a change or an action in response to the stimulus or in response to this information that's received. And the brain is important for being able to process that. And how does it do this? By sending out action potentials or electrical signals through the nerves. And that's basically what we've talked about in regards to how the neurological system, how the brain and the neurological system really functions. Okay, so in summary, again, the neurological system, when we look at it, is basically two parts. It's the central nervous system, which is only the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is all the rest of the nervous system outside the brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nerves, cranial nerves, you know, and spinal nerves, the whole shebang at that. We also talked about what happens. There's two types of situations: a somatic situation, which is more voluntary, versus autonomic, which is more involuntary. It just happens because it's there. We talked about that involuntary autonomic system is involved in both a sympathetic and parasympathetic system. Sympathetic generally speeds things up, with the exception of the GI tract, and parasympathetic has a tendency to slow things down, again with the exception of the GI tract. And this is all based upon the fact that the brain is important in regards to maintaining homeostasis, keeping the body the same. If we look at lower animals like frogs and stuff like that, basically they don't really talk to each other, but the body, the back part of the brain, or the lower centers of the brain, the part that integrate the more autonomic portions, are basically very much are what most of the brain is. They don't have a whole lot of the upper centers because they're not thinking a whole lot. In other words, most of their decisions are made based upon automatic responses. And where in humans, what happens is we've developed a lot more of an advanced brain with a lot more integrative function, voluntary integrative function that we're able to work. So this is just about some of the function of the nervous system. We'll be talking a little bit more in our next discussion about some of the parts of the nervous system or the nerves itself, and we'll go from there.